Top 10 is what we'll be looking at today. So a few things I want to start off with. There are as many approaches to threat modeling as there are people, probably more. So this is a particular way to build a threat model from the OWASP Mobile Top 10. Might not be the one that works for you, but the important thing is that you do find one that does work for yourself or a development team. So that's important to note that there are different approaches. And if you do have questions, then do just jump in and ask them, type them in the Q&A window. I will answer them as we go rather than saving them till the end. There will be breaks during this. I have been told before that it can be quite information heavy when I do these sessions, so I have got some timed breaks in. When those come up, feel free to stay on and ask questions. I'll be dropping off for a bit to grab myself a glass of water or something. So feel free to ask some questions then, or just stretch your legs and digest everything. So hopefully the screen is now visible and we can get started. Now I do other workshops. This is not an advanced one, but if you've been to one of the previous ones, you will find it useful. You'll also find it useful if you've done some sort of mobile application design and or development. It's not essential, but it is useful. And I'm going to kick off with some definitions. For the purposes of this workshop, these definitions are unassailable truths. You might disagree with them, you might have a different perspective, that's fine. But for the purposes of this, these are absolutely true. So the first one is that we have a threat. That's the thing that we're building a model for. And a threat is very specifically outside of our control. It's not something that we can influence. Then we have vulnerabilities. And vulnerability is a weakness that exists within our system. So it is something we can control. And we have an impact. And that's what happens if there's a threat which exploits a vulnerability. And finally, we have a risk, and that's the combination of the threat, the vulnerability, and the impact. And this is important in threat modeling because you can build a threat model and have your list of threats. If there's not a vulnerability, then you don't have a risk coming out at the other end. So the whole point is that you build your threat model, you then use that to look for vulnerabilities, and then obviously impacts as well. And if you lack a threat which will exploit a vulnerability, or lack a vulnerability, or lack an impact, then you do not have a risk, so you can ignore it. So some other bits. As I said, ask questions at any time. There are breaks built in, and the exercise is designed to be interactive, so please do interact with it. I think I'll probably ask if you can be allowed to talk for that, because we don't have the chat window up and available, and it might be more challenging to do it through Q&A. Right. What are the OWASP Mobile Top 10? Well, first released in 2011, been through a few versions, most recently reworked in 2016 to focus on the application over the server backend. And it's actually two lists included. So one is the top 10 risks for mobile development, and one is the top 10 controls for mobile development. There are other OWASP top 10s, including the famous OWASP top 10 itself, which is about web vulnerabilities, but we're looking at mobile today. Now, what do we need for threat modeling? We've got the OWASP top 10, that's great. What can we actually do with it? Well, as said, we need to have a threat, a vulnerability, and an impact. And then what we want to get out of it is the risk. And if we are missing any of those three, we don't get a risk out. That means we cannot resolve the risk. Next question is, what do we actually do once we've got that risk out? Well, you have a risk, brilliant. You put a control in place, you remediate it, you mitigate it, you do something to reduce the risk to a level that's acceptable. So ultimately, threat modeling is really about doing risk management during the design phase of a project rather than after you've deployed it. And the whole point of that is that if you are building your security requirements and your security controls into the foundation of a project, into that architectural design, into that fundamental design principle set that you're using, then you are going to save an awful lot of time and effort compared to ignoring it until you've deployed it. It's much more expensive to fix something after you've built it than it is to fix it in design. So that's the aim. Next thing we need for threat modeling is keep it short and simple. Now, there are disagreements on this, and there are reasons that you might want to use a advanced or formal threat modeling approach. That's fine, and I highly recommend them where an organization or a team is advanced enough with threat modeling, is practiced enough at it to make use of one of those approaches. The whole point of this workshop is it's introductory, it's basics of threat modeling. It's looking at how you can do it quickly and easily. It's not going into a 5-day course on how you can do it intensively with a full formal process to pick up as much as possible. It is how do we get to the right questions to pick up the risks and put in place the controls with very little effort. Because trying to drop it in as a full-fledged, here is your mature threat modeling capability, just from experience working with development teams, that is a very painful way to do it and usually gets abandoned. So you need to build up from something simple and usable and then mature it as you go, rather than trying to drop in the full capability immediately into a team that's not ready for it. Right, that's the precursors out of the way. So if we take a break now, got about 5 minutes and you'll see the bar fill up. And after that, we'll go into the meat of it. So now's your time to get a coffee, get a glass of water, stretch your legs, do a little bit of yoga, whatever you're comfortable with to get ready for the main technical bulk of this.
So during the break, I'm just going to give a little more household information. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A panel. You can also raise a hand, and then I will be able to allow you to speak so you could directly ask James something. These question sessions are going to take place during the breaks. So if you will raise a hand, we will give you the opportunity to speak during the next break time.
Okay, hoping everyone's back. My filler bar did not work quite as intended there. Maybe next time. If anyone isn't back, please raise your hand and let me know. Okay. Now, I'm going to go against one of the earlier things I said here, or rather OWASP go against it by saying that the mobile top 10 are the top 10 risks. For the purposes of, again, this workshop, that list is not the risks. That list is the potential attacks, the potential threats that someone might use. So they are things that are fundamentally outside of our control. We have limited influence over them. They are not risks because they are not paired with a vulnerability and an impact. And number one is improper platform usage. So improper platform usage is all about misusing the platform, whether that's failing to use security controls on the platform, such as fingerprint scanning, PIN codes. I believe the recordings will be shared later on, but Limor, can you confirm?
Absolutely, the recording will be shared. That's why we're doing it, in order to be able to provide it for anyone, who might have missed the session and wants to listen again. It's going to be provided on our site.
Okay. Yes, so that's also encryption, for example. And the exposure of these is usually by some form of API call and a failure to use features which are present on the platform. You will see a lot of this type of comic on here because I found they're the best way to explain, give an idea. But as an example, failure to properly encrypt the passwords. There you go. So I'll give everyone a few seconds just to read that if you want to. And for anyone concerned, I'm not drinking beer in the morning. This is a caffeinated soft drink. Next one is insecure data storage. Well, that's again a failure to properly encrypt. It's a failure to protect the data storage, whether that's through permissioning. It's a failure to properly segregate the data, maybe using a common store which shouldn't be used, and can be various other things. Example here, the authorization model is broken, the data is stored in a common area or commonly accessible. So, and next one, insecure communication. So if you're familiar with cryptography and how you speak about cryptography, you'll know about Alice, Bob, and Eve. And ultimately, insecure communication is when Eve can drop in and read the message in some way. Really, for our purposes, this boils down to never trust the network. Never trust anything over which we're communicating. Always assume it's compromised and take precautions. Simple as that. And insecure authentication. So again, I mentioned the fingerprint scanner earlier. One of the main reasons that this comes up with mobile in particular is because you've got input restrictions. It's harder to type in a full password, so things will often rely on a short PIN code. PIN codes are much easier to guess, and you've got a much smaller search space if you are able to somehow retrieve the secure storage of the PIN as well. So insecure authentication is either incorrectly implemented or just insufficiently secure. So a 4-character PIN or a 4-digit PIN to get into your bank and perform a transaction is not sufficient in any real world scenario. And insufficient cryptography. So we're now halfway through at number 5. Insufficient cryptography, there is crossover here with the insecure data storage. There is crossover here with the insecure communication. There's crossover with insecure authentication. But insufficient cryptography is using a weak cryptographic cipher or cryptographic method when you need something more secure. Again, quite a simple one. Now, the difference between authentication and authorization is that authentication is when you prove to me who you are. Authorization is when you prove to me that you have permission to do a particular thing. So you've got authentication first, and then authorization is a second check to say, are you permitted to do this? And insecure authorization, very much like insecure authentication, it's a broken permissions model. In some way, it is a failure to properly authenticate again. So it's allowing someone to do one login and then within that session, trusting them to perform sensitive operations when you probably want to get them to authorize those operations. Anything along those lines comes under insecure authorization. Next one is client code quality. That's about, obviously, failure to properly code. So that's having incorrect syntax, that's having incorrectly escaped parameters, so that someone can inject code, or buffer overflows can be a result. Anything that leads to a bug in the client in particular is in some way the client code quality at fault. Usually it is untrusted or incorrectly sanitized inputs and outputs. Now, you cannot ever guarantee that every single app on the client is good, has been well coded, has no weaknesses. You can't even guarantee they're not malicious. So like with the network, where you simply never trust the network because you don't control it, you never trust the device. You have to assume at any point that the device your app is going to be installed on is compromised, and therefore your app must take responsibility for its own security to a reasonable level. That's not, it must wipe everything else off the device, but you have to assume that there will be unauthorized attempts to access the data that your app stores, as an example, or to use the privileges it has. So protect your own app and limit your trust of any other apps, any other endpoints. And code tampering. So code tampering is compromised versions of apps. They may be in the App Store. Usually they're loaded from unauthorized or independent app stores, or side-loaded from other sources. They may be reverse engineered from your own app in an unofficial store. And in some cases, advanced attackers, years ago, there was an issue with the iPhone certificates or the Apple certificates for companies, which would have allowed this. It may be possible to inject code into legitimate versions of apps, either by sitting in the middle of an enterprise solution and saying that you're the App Store and you've got compromised versions of the apps, or through injecting flaws or your own code into open source projects or closed source projects if you can gain access. So code tampering is another of the potential attacks to worry about with mobile. And reverse engineering. Well, reverse engineering can lead to code tampering. It can also give an understanding of weak code quality. So if there are bugs in your code, reverse engineering will allow someone to discover it. Now, what's important here is that reverse engineering is not really an attack in and of itself. It leads to other attacks being discovered. Most mobile code can be quite easily reverse engineered, so you just have to accept it. And where it gets interesting is with the code quality, because the more readable, the more understandable, and the more clean the code, the easier it is to reverse engineer. Equally, the fewer flaws will be in it. So you have to make a choice between obscuring the code and making it harder to work on, or simply accepting that reverse engineering will be a possibility, and therefore you allow for that and you protect the functionality as much as you can by moving it to other systems, by moving it to other components. My recommendation is always assume anything you do will be reverse engineered and never rely on security by obscurity. So security by obscurity gets a bad rap, but where people say never use security by obscurity, I'm completely against that. I think you should use it. You should take reasonable precautions not to spread information around that could be compromised or could lead to a compromise, but you should never rely on something being kept secret as your one and only form of security. It's still good practice, it's just not something to lean on. And then we've got the final one on the mobile top 10 risks, which aren't risks, which is extraneous functionality. And that's where there's more functionality than the app or than the client really needs or than the device really needs. It's where someone has piled in too much functionality, too much ability to do things, and some of that can be compromised to work around other restrictions. And this comes down to a principle of minimum function or least privilege. Never let any system do more than it should. Yes, it's nice to have extra features, but if they are not required, then either move them off to something else or restrict them in some way, or better yet, simply don't implement them. Something you don't implement cannot be exploited. So you should always go for the minimum. Are there any questions about any of these 10? Any more detail needed on them? Any dispute about whether they deserve a place in the top 10? Okay, so in that case, we go into the next break just so that you can properly digest that. And again, ask any questions that you might have.
So as we are on break time, just a quick reminder again, if you have questions, type them into the Q&A tab, or you can raise your virtual hand and we're going to be able to allow you to speak so you can ask something during the break. Again, questions we collect are going to be answered during the break time. So go ahead. If you have anything, let us know. James, we have one question. Would you like to answer it now or would you like to answer it after the break?
I'll answer that one after the break.
Are you able to see it yourself or should I read it out for everyone?
I can see it, so that's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So we're back in, and on that question, everything that applies to mobile clients, mobile apps, all of these, equally, they apply to an SDK. So again, it's things like never trust the platform, never trust the network. The user is not responsible for, the end user is not responsible for securing the app. However, if you are providing a mobile SDK, depending on what it's providing access to, it may be reasonable to expect the developer of the actual end app to implement security. So it depends what you're allowing access to. If, for example, you're providing a mobile SDK for banking, I would fully expect that to inherently include all of the potential security functionality that might be needed. So it's an it depends answer, which I hope answers the question there. Do feel free to put your hand up if you want to dig in more around that. But no, there's no specific special points. It's essentially just a generic app that people can use to develop more apps from the point of view of this sort of threat modeling. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the Parkerian Hexad now. So you may be familiar with the CIA triangle: confidentiality, integrity, availability. The Parkerian Hexad is an extension of that, which brings in a bit of extra, or a few extra attributes, and the idea is that with the extra 3 it brings in, they are atomic security attributes. In other words, you cannot decompose them any further. And I will explain what this has to do with the top 10 shortly, but for now, if we run through them. So we've got confidentiality. Everyone's familiar with this. It's about you should only be able to know what you need to know. You don't need to know what you don't need to know. And so if you've got access to something you don't need to know, that's a failure of confidentiality. You've got possession or control. Now this is one of the extra ones, and that's about, even if I don't know the information, if I hold it, if I hold the storage of it, then that may be a failure. So if it's encrypted on a device that I hold and I shouldn't know the information, that opens up certain risks, even if it is securely encrypted. Just a slight audio failure there. Yeah, so possession or control can be about the device, can be about the storage. It's about who controls the device, who controls the storage, who controls the application. Integrity, again, a familiar one. That's about, is the information, is the communication the same when it ends as when it starts? Is the information unaltered? Has anything been done to it? Can we trust it? Not necessarily is the information true, but is the information we have received the same as the information sent? Is the information we have collected the same as the information that was submitted? And authenticity, this is more about, separate from integrity, this is, does the source that sent the information, is the source that sent the information the source it says it is? So this is about authentication. It's about that, are you the person who submitted that information, and can you prove it? So that's beyond integrity. That's a whole separate thing of, is the source right? Then there's availability. Is it available when we need it? Very straightforward one. And finally, utility. Utility is an interesting one. Utility is it useful to us? So even if we've got appropriately controlled information in terms of confidentiality, we've got the storage in our control, that's great. We know that the integrity is good because we've been doing full auditing. We know that the authenticity is good because we did asynchronous, asymmetric encryption, so that we know that the source is good and we know that it was encrypted the whole way through, and we know that it's available because it's plugged in. It's still not necessarily useful data. So utility is about, is it useful, and can be related to a few other things as well. And this is how I tie the Parkerian Hexad across, because ultimately everything on that top 10 risks you can say is a failure of one or more controls. So improper platform usage, well, we cannot trust the integrity of the platform. Simple as that. There's also questions around the confidentiality and possession, and there's questions around the utility, but let's say it's integrity for now. So long as we can map all of them across and say that they're covered by the 6, then we can use those 6 attributes as the basis for how we're going to do threat modeling. Insecure data storage, that's confidentiality and or possession. Insecure communication is confidentiality and or possession. Insecure authentication is quite straightforward. That's about authenticity. Insecure cryptography is about confidentiality. Insecure authorization, authenticity and possession again. Client code quality, possession and or utility. Code tampering, integrity and or authenticity. And reverse engineering is about possession. If someone possesses the code, there's also a confidentiality issue in there. And the extraneous functionality is about utility. So what we can say is that, yes, the Hexad does cover everything. So we can approach that top 10 using the Parkerian Hexad and using those 6 atomic attributes rather than saying, is there improper platform usage? And this will be important when we get to the example. So next, I did mention earlier that there's also the OWASP Mobile top 10 controls, which are also relevant for our threat modeling. And they're a bit more wordy. But just running through them, you've got identify and protect sensitive data on the mobile device, handle password credentials securely on the device, ensure sensitive data is protected in transit, implement user authentication, keep the backend APIs and the platform secure, secure data integration with third-party services and applications, pay specific attention to the collection and storage of consent. I don't know why it's specifically consent. I would say it's of data in general and information, but there you go. Implement controls to prevent unauthorized access to paid for resources, also to free resources. Don't worry just about paid ones. Ensure secure distribution and provisioning of mobile applications and carefully check any runtime interpretation of code for errors. What you will notice is that these 10 controls map very, very closely to the top 10 risks. So each of these controls would prevent the corresponding risk to a large degree, not necessarily complete coverage, but that's what they've been built upon. So moving on from that, confidentiality. Well, which ones does it apply to? So 5 of them are confidentiality controls. Possessional control, there's 6. And you may disagree with how these are assigned. I'll tell you why it doesn't matter in a bit. So identify and protect sensitive data, that's about possession of it. Handle password credentials, that's got a possession aspect. Backend APIs and the platform, that's a possession or control aspect. Secure data into third-party services, that's again possession or control. Specific attention around collection and storage, that's again got a possession and control aspect. And preventing unauthorized access to paid for resources, well, if you've got something on the device that is a paid for resource that someone can gain access to, there is a possession issue around that. Integrity always comes into play a huge amount. Arguably it could even be applied to the other 2 here as well, but I've just stuck it on the 8 so far. Authenticity, yeah, so that covers 6 of them. Availability, well, that's covering 5. Utility, and that's it. So are there questions around those or how I've assigned them at all? Right. Now, why I say it doesn't matter how they're assigned, it's just to show that they do cover everything. Ultimately, as I said at the beginning, threat modeling is about getting a useful, usable system. It's about getting something we can use to ask the right questions, and this is very much introductory, very much a basic way of doing that. So you could, if you wanted, threat model using the National Vulnerability Database and individually take each and every vulnerability from that database, look at your system design, look at the interface points on it and say, does that vulnerability apply there? You could do that. I would not recommend it because it will take you forever. And by the time you've done it, you could have just built a secure system several times over anyway. This is why it's got to be something that's useful and can be built into your design process in a very light touch, very easy way. As your design process matures, you can start asking deeper questions because you are building up the understanding. Whenever I'm putting threat modeling into place in an organization, I do it working with the developers, but I do it in such a way that it does not rely on me or any other security resource, if at all possible. So I will help development to build out their threat model and help them to use it. But ultimately, it has to be simple enough and it has to be usable enough that they can take ownership of it, they can adopt it, they can progress it. I can be brought in to answer specific questions and to feed in information, and any other security person could be brought in to do the same, but it needs to be part of the whole design and development process. It is not a separate security process that should be held close by security. It is very much a baby for development to hold and take charge of if you want it to be useful. And I say development, um, that's mainly because in this one we're talking about mobile development specifically. Threat modeling applies to just, or can apply to just about any system design. So it doesn't just have to be technical. You could look at a marketing campaign, business plan, building a building, secure building. Um, you can look at policy frameworks, anything that can be defined as a system and can be seen as a system and laid out in some sort of design, you can threat model against. But the vital bit is that it has to be done by the people doing the design so that it's properly embedded. Because if security just sit there and say, we're going to build a threat model and we're going to do threat modeling of your design, here you are, here's the output. First, there's no buy-in. Secondly, it's not that useful because you understand the risks by going through the steps of threat modeling, by looking at your threat model and applying it. So your threat model has to be usable to be useful, which I know sounds overly true, but it is. And it has to be used to be useful, which means that it has to be owned by the people doing the design, not by some independent team or completely separate resource who come in, parachute it in from the sky, do it, and then walk away. Okay. Are there any questions around that? My little diatribe on threat modeling and how you should do it. Okay, so going into the last break. So if you do need to stretch your legs, then I suggest you do it now, because after this we'll be going into the exercise, and the exercise is going to be much more interactive. We may throw in a few breaks during the exercise, but that'll be a separate thing. So ask any questions now, stretch your legs, do anything you need to do, because the next bit is going to be much more interactive. I'm going to have much more in the way of questions for people, and we're going to do a threat modeling exercise against an app of some kind. So have a think about which app you'd like to threat model. It will be very conceptual threat modeling, but we'll go through it there. Okay, so we didn't have any more questions. So moving on, we'll go into an actual exercise now. So I'm going to be doing this using 3-tier architecture model. And that will be both for the client and the server side. Which one we do will depend on time and the example that's picked. But fundamentally, it's the same for either. For those not familiar with a 3-tier model, what you have is the idea of a presentation layer. That's the GUI that's presented to people. The application layer that provides the actual functionality, and the data storage layer. Now, if you're looking at a mobile application, you may have all three of those on the device. You may have a presentation layer on the device and an application layer on a backend server. You may have them replicated on both. You may just have storage on the server, but ultimately you will have some number or some combination of those three layers in some way. If you've got all three on the device and all three replicated on the server, that's absolutely fine. You can still do the same threat modeling. You're just looking at doing it against 6 different layers, 6 different architecture designs instead. Because we're doing mobile, we'll probably end up focusing very much on the client, but we might end up looking at the server. So the big thing is anyone unfamiliar with the 3-tier architecture model? Or does it not make sense to anyone? Does anyone need it to be elaborated on? Okay. So, given that, now methods to do threat modeling, which are acceptable. You can do it with the whiteboard, you can do it with magnets, you can do it with post-it notes, you can do it with comments on design documents, you can do it with a blackboard and chalk, you can do it sketching in the dirt. However you want to do it, that's absolutely fine. So there's no particular method, no particular tool that is fundamentally the right way to do it. The important thing is that it's done, so use the tools that are available. I tend to go with whiteboards because I find it very easy to think on a whiteboard, but I have done it before using automated systems from Microsoft, which help to build out a threat model, and there's other ones out there. I've done it using cards and card games, all sorts of different options. But what I really need to know at this point is which app we're going to threat model. So I'm hoping there will be an answer from the audience and that someone will be able to say, yes, here's an app to do. Don't care which one you pick, so long as I've heard of it. Or it could be a generic one. You could say banking, doesn't matter. And if someone either wants to put their hand up and volunteer or type it into the Q&A, since we don't have chat. Okay, I'm going to suggest that we go with Pokemon Go because it's got some interesting quirks that other ones might not. TikTok, I'm not going down that route. That's a thread I don't want to really unravel now. There's too much debate around it. So if we go with Pokemon Go. No, it doesn't have to be an app made by you. It's just any app. So, Pokemon Go. Right, well, we have the presentation tier of Pokemon Go. Fairly straightforward. We know what it looks like. Let's say it's on the overworld, and I've just realized I need to do a switch. So hopefully this will work because this is experimental. So I'm hoping you can all see that. Right, Pokemon Go, we've all got an idea of what it looks like. There's one screen, and there's your overworld map. I'm not very good at drawing an overworld map. Something like that for the main map. Let's put another road in, and we will have a Pokemon there. Does that look at least vaguely familiar to everyone? Can you recognize Pokemon Go-ish in that? And then we'll also have our menu, which is our standard configuration menu there. By the way, Limor, if you could simply let anyone with their hand up speak, because if there are questions, anything like that, right now I'm going to be concentrating more on the whiteboard, so I'll need the interruption to get my attention. Now, I mentioned before, quite early on in this, that it's about interfaces, it's about inputs, outputs, and about storage assets. Really, those are the only three things you've got. You have places that things are stored, and you have places that things go into and out of. And those are the only attack surfaces that really exist or that we need to care about in design. So what we need to ask here is what threats or what vulnerabilities exist that might allow our threats to attack. And the way we're going to do that is to go through the Parkerian Hexad and consider each one, and we're going to consider that against each and every input that's available to us. So to take an example, confidentiality. Are there any confidentiality potential issues that you can see on this interface at the moment?
James, we have a question from one of the attendees.
Yep.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, the password shouldn't be exposed inside the app.
Yep. So yeah, so that's definitely one. We'll probably find that most of them relate to the password because most of the rest of it isn't sensitive. But password shouldn't be exposed is a very important one to pick up. And that's a confidentiality issue. Either it shouldn't be exposed at all, or it certainly shouldn't be displayed in clear text. Next one, possession or control. Well, I'll be honest, there isn't really a possession or control issue on this because the user should be in possession of all of the information they've got there. Now, when we're starting to talk about the application and the backend storage, that might not apply, but right at the moment, everything there is something that we want the user to hold anyway. So all of that can be stored on the device. Except you will notice if you go offline in Pokemon Go, that you no longer see Pokemon. That is because that information is held by the backend server. So there is a potential possession risk there. If someone were able to get hold of that, and for a while they were with some third-party apps, then that's a possession or control problem because we don't want that exposed to our end users in full. We want them to have to discover that as they walk around. That's the whole aim, get people walking around. If you know exactly where everything is without moving around, it renders our app largely pointless. So we do have a possession or control. What about integrity? Can you see any integrity potential vulnerabilities there? Yep.
Maybe the position of the player.
Yep, possibly the position of the player. So this, by the way, is experimental. I've not actually done whiteboarding of a threat model during one of these sessions before, so I will be interested in any feedback on it, and I hope it's working as I wanted it to. Right, yeah, position of the player, GPS spoofing is something we actually want to watch for. So we do want to make sure that the actual position, we have integrity. Okay, and authenticity. Is there anything to worry about with that one here?
Well, I guess the app should verify that it's indeed speaking with the 9tech backend instead of a man-in-the-middle proxy or something.
Yep, that one we'll get to with the application layer, because at the moment we're not really too concerned with that side of things, but yeah, that will be one. In terms of this, what we want is authenticity is it the right user? Is it the right user information displayed? Availability, well, we've kind of got that. We know that if the servers aren't available, the service isn't available. And utility, people can argue about the usefulness of Pokemon Go. It did get people walking, people do enjoy it. So let's say, yeah, and there we go, that's another one. So app-specific links. So this is going off third party into your browser here. So someone creates a malicious spoofed link, which, I don't know, gets you to trade some Pokemon away. So there's one. And yep, integrity again. So hopefully this gives you a quick idea of how you can do this type of threat modeling against the interface side. We will get on to the others. The aim really of a good threat model is to get you asking the right questions, and it's the right questions around the inputs, the outputs, and the storage. And when you're asking the right questions, you can then start putting controls in place. So, for example, do we have integrity for the time data? Well, let's make sure that in our app we design it and match with server. We've decided we care about the time, so we want that to match with the server. Is it the right user info? Well, yes, that's definitely one that we want to care about. So we want authentication built in. We want an authentication or an authenticity control applied. Password shouldn't be in clear text. There is a question of whether the password should be stored in any way in clear text. So let's apply a confidentiality control, which will be encryption, one-way password hashing. And we might also stick in a salt, possibly a pepper as well. Let's see. So that position data is possessed by Niantic. That's not on the device, but is source genuine. So again, building into our design, we want to have an authenticity check there. Links with intent. Can we do some sort of authorization there as part of our design? If something comes with an intent for Pokemon Go, can we make sure it's from a valid source or that it's not trying to do something it shouldn't? Should we simply say any source, any intent that comes in, we want to do some sort of confirmation? And yet, is the phone rooted? That's another one that we want to worry about. So that will, in this case, obviously, it's harder to spoof GPS if you haven't rooted the device. It is possible, but most people don't run around with a full GPS spoofing rig just to play Pokemon Go. I'm sure there's some out there who do, but most people don't. Let's ignore the ones who do. But yeah, we can do a routing check there, and especially for banking apps, as mentioned, or as Rafi mentioned, that's a genuine concern. Are there any others you'd like to pull out here or question around? Or can you see the intent of using the Parkerian Hexad to ask the questions and then design in the requirements and look at all of the inputs, outputs? Okay, let me just get rid of these. So the next one we're going to do is to look at the application layer. Now, this is obviously a bit more abstract, and my design skills or drawing skills are not fantastic. But let's say we start off with the API around Pokemon position. I don't know the actual back end of Pokemon Go. This is just how I might design it if I was building out the API. So Pokemon info. CP obviously is their combat potential, I think. Obviously shiny Pokemon are something people care about. And Pokemon info is a method. We'll say it's a call to the backend, and it will be a call to the server backend because it's something that's held on the server. Then we will also have, let's say, map call and let's have login as well. Obviously, there will be many more calls. This is just quickly sketched out design. So again, we can apply the same thing to this, and we probably will add some more calls and methods as we go. But let's say that first one, the CP rating. Is there any particular confidentiality threat we need to care about there? Well, it's public information we're going to be displaying to the user unless they're looking at Pokemon they shouldn't be, because we will have the input of GPS. So we send our GPS position and we get back, yep, here's some Pokemon which are around. And if you play Pokemon Go, you will notice that they don't spawn in the same position for everyone, but they do spawn within the same range for everyone. And that's because it's done based on a query of GPS, but they don't care about the exact position it appears in. So that's left to your phone to decide. So we send the GPS position as an input and we get the output of, yep, there's a Pokemon there, here's the CP rating, the name, the number, and is it shiny or not? So inputs and outputs, first one's first. If we go for GPS, that's one where there's obviously questions. Now, is there a confidentiality issue there? Do we need to worry about threats to confidentiality if we're sending GPS position? Okay, so I'm going to guess that you're going to say yes as well. We've got a yes in the Q&A, and yeah, definitely care about confidentiality there. I'd argue it's probably the most sensitive piece of information that Pokemon Go have to deal with, me sending them exactly where I am. Okay. And is there a possession or control issue around that? Well, I'd argue probably again, yes. We don't want someone else to be in possession of it. We want it only to come to us. Integrity. Do we care about integrity of that information? And Limor, if you could just turn on speaking.
Yes. Let me see who should. Oh, it's the same person. Okay. There you go. Please go ahead.
Yes, we do care about the integrity from Niantic perspective.
Yep. So the first two, obviously, we care from the Niantic perspective, but only because we care about the users not being mugged, frankly. But the other ones, or integrity, we care particularly from the Niantic perspective, because if people are spoofing, if people are sending fake location info, that's a genuine concern for us. And Alex has just made the point that GPS is less confidential if it's anonymized. That is absolutely true. And that leads to another part of it. So we can say, okay, let's anonymize GPS. Yeah. So any query based on that, we will anonymize. That reduces it. That is a confidentiality control, which is great. We've put that control in place. The call for Pokemon info is now fully anonymized. Brilliant. What does that introduce? Are there additional concerns, additional threats we then need to worry about because we've anonymized, which may not be so much about privacy of the user, but might be on our side as Niantic? Is there a trade-off of some kind involved? And the answer is yes, because it does mean we need to think about how we're going to question on the integrity side. So if we're anonymizing, it means we need to get creative when we're doing authentication. So when we're looking at protecting the confidentiality of GPS position by anonymizing the data, we then need to decide what we're going to do to make sure we've still maintained authenticity. So we don't want to send any identifying information. That's great. That means we can't do the username. We have to come up with some other way to do it. Right. And yeah, there's definitely an authenticity issue there. Is there an availability issue? Ultimately, if the information's not there, it's not there, and that's on the user rather than us. So let's say that we don't care about that. And utility, well, we also don't particularly care about that. We know it will be usable because that's part of our fundamental design already. But we need to balance up the other four. Now, from the other side, from the client side, from the app sitting on the phone, let's look at, say, CP rating. Is there a, sensor data must absolutely be kept safe on the server. So that's a confidentiality and a possession one again. CP rating. Is there a confidentiality issue around CP rating when we're returning it to the device? Do we care in any way if someone can intercept the CP rating, or the name, or the Pokemon number, or whether it's a shiny? Bearing in mind, to intercept it, they'd have to be a man in the middle, which doesn't mean that they're geographically proximate to the client. Or they must have stolen someone's phone, in which case, frankly, there's not much we can do. Or they must have direct access to the server in some way. But for any of those, do we care at all about that rating, since we're not sending the position back? give you the answer, and it is that no, we don't. Confidentiality of that information going back to the phone is completely unimportant. But we do care about the integrity of it, and we care about the authenticity, because we don't want someone to be able to spoof our endpoint and send back loads of rare, shiny Pokemon. So there are concerns there. With the other information, same thing. With the map, so the map we're probably storing on the phone itself, and really there, it's not a major concern. We don't need the layout to be 100% accurate, except for the Pokestop information. With the login, well, yeah, we've got a very much a confidentiality issue. Probably the biggest one we care about after the GPS position. In terms of integrity and authenticity, sort of, but they are our means for... Limor, could you let Sukan speak?
Yes, I am just looking for the, so I could see who it is. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I just saw a bunch of attendees.
Hello, did you have a question? You're on mute if you're trying to speak at the moment.
So
Hello?
can you, yes, hi.
Hello. Just one question. How username can be can we bypass means it's a very confidential thing right now in the social platform, right? So anyone can copy username or anything else. So how can we just recognize that this username is means authenticate or not?
Yep, no, that's definitely a good question. So there are, let's look at some options if we're doing username, and let's go more generic. We can say, yes, we want to check with the password, or rather the password hash, because we never want to transmit the password in the clear. We could also say, okay, when you install the app and do that first authentication against the server, let's install a client certificate. And if you don't have that client certificate, we don't trust that you are who you say you are. There's various things we can do. Ultimately, it will be some form of authenticity check that we're trying to do. Does that answer the question you were asking?
Yep.
Okay, brilliant. And yeah, in terms of the password, well, real question here is, should we ever store the password on the client device? It's an open question I'm putting out there.
Might be no.
Yeah, I'm pleased to see that everyone is saying no. There is never a need to store the password, certainly in clear text on the device. Arguably, you might want to store a hash, but honestly, it's a bad habit. If you're trying to store authentication data, it's better to use the password as a way to access, for example, a certificate. And as has been mentioned by, hopefully I'll get this right, Ms. Danak, you can implement device binding in various ways. You can look at device unique parameters such as IMEI. That does bring in a whole other load of integrity and authenticity checks. And here's the other bit of threat modeling. At a certain point, you have to decide that you have exhausted the reasonable threats. So when you are doing a threat modeling session against any particular system, I recommend, Nimor, we've just got someone else with their hand up. Had someone else with their hand up. It's okay. No, it's back up now.
Yes, I just wanted to say that you might need to store the clear text passwords if you need to send it to third-party company or something like that.
Yep. The question I would ask then is, should you be using a third-party company who are asking you to store the password in clear text?
Nope.
So yes, they do exist. it raises some very big questions about their security practices and what you're using them for. Where was I? Secure storage has been mentioned. Yes, you might store, say, a hashed password. So you might store it effectively as a token that you can send on when you need to. But yeah, you should never store it completely in clear text. Where was I? Right, yes. So there will come a certain point where you have exhausted the plausible threats. So as an example, I could say I care. Yep.
Question. You were talking about storing hashed password being a bad habit, right?
Yep.
So I was thinking immediately of like the LSAS process, how it stores like hashed passwords.
Sorry,
what do you mean?
LSAS,
Windows LSAS.
Oh yeah.
It stores like NTLM hashes.
Yep.
You think
it does.
that's like a bad habit, or you mean more like for programming apps or something?
No, it's definitely a bad habit for Windows as well.
All right.
And it is a genuine problem. There are attacks based on the fact that you store NTLM hashes. You may have heard of pass the hash attacks.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
yeah,
of course, but it's like how Windows works.
Yes, it is. And this is the whole thing about using threat modeling for security by design. So it's been how Windows has worked for a long, long time. It is so baked in that realistically, it is almost certainly never going to be fixed. To fix it, you would have to fully reinvent the way that Windows does authentication. There are mitigations that have been put in, such as validity periods and other things, but you can see that they still leave this risk exposed. Whereas if it had been designed from the beginning not to store that data, not to store that sensitive data, because theoretically it doesn't need to, then there you go. That would have solved a lot of problems. We'd be in a much better place with security if they'd done security by design from the beginning.
How would you implement like Windows authentication without the stored password?
So the ideal way would be to use the password to, well, Kerberos is an example. So you get a ticket which is valid for a certain period or a certain operation. When you enter the password, you might do that with sessions and then regenerate the session as needed. But you don't need to store the password to do that. You can do a ticket for the session and you can re-authenticate or just generate a new ticket when needed without storing that password hash. You've still got some risks. Sorry?
Yeah, for renewing tickets, you would have to enter the password again.
Not necessarily. If you use an existing valid ticket when it's getting to the end of its validity period to generate the next ticket, then you don't have to store the password again. You can do it only when you're generating a new session. There are other controls and other issues that need to be built up around it. So I'm not saying it's the easiest solution. It's just that it is possible not to store the password.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Right. Yes, so there will come a certain point where you have exhausted all of the plausible threats. So speaking about that GPS spoofing example, for someone like Niantic, they could easily do a check that the device isn't rooted. And we could say, yes, there's still a risk that someone might be using genuine spoofed GPS infrastructure to change their position in Pokemon Go by building it into a Faraday cage and replicating GPS signals. It is something that someone could do. But realistically, as Niantic, where we're just doing a game, do we need to care about that level of threat? If we're building a highly sensitive system, we might. But if we're talking about something like a game, we can just say that that is completely outside of our threat model. It's not worth putting the resources in to deal with it. And that's the thing. Once you've exhausted the plausible threats, you need to stop threat modeling and start applying the controls and applying the design principles that come out of it to your architecture and to your design as you go. I find normally a maximum is about, say, 2 hours at most for a system, and you'll get most of the realistic threats then. You don't want to spend longer because you do end up going down rabbit holes such as the, well, what if someone took over a satellite and used that to send us misleading GPS data? And if you're dealing with something like Pokemon Go, the answer is, what if they did? It's someone else's problem and it's bigger than us and we don't care. They might get some Pokemon that they shouldn't. And if they're willing to go to those lengths to do it, we just are not going to be able to deal with it. Okay. Are there any others people want to pull out from this one before we go on to the storage side? Okay. So, storage. We have our data store, and we have our local cache, which will hold maps, Pokemon, items, etc. As this will hold Pokemon, items, etc. And in the middle of this, we have our app or our client. I say in the middle, actually sitting there. Now, I don't know if everyone will be familiar with the CRUD model. So create, read, update, delete. The idea is that it is the only 4 operations that you can actually perform on data. And again, when we're threat modeling, we're looking at very simple ways to do things because we want to be able to ask the questions quickly. So applying the CRUD model to these, do we want the client to be able to, let's start with maps. Do we want the client to be able to create, read, update, delete, and are there any security risks that come about by doing so? Oh, we briefly had a hand up, but it's gone again. The answer with maps is yes, we want them to be able to create and read and probably update and also delete because it sits on the client. It's just to display their local map to them. As Niantic on our server side, we don't care at all about that. We just have the GPS position of particular things and we send that when someone is within range of them. That's all we need to care about. What about the Pokemon? Well, let's say here we want to be concerned about create operations and update operations, but not read. We're fine with them being able to read, but any create actually raises integrity issues around their local Pokemon store. And the way that we can deal with that would be, as an example, and this is what they actually do, comparing against a trusted source. So if you are offline, you can't get into your Pokemon store, you will have a local cache of the Pokemon that are there. It is possible to tamper with that cache. If you do so, it will be updated and any changes made to it will be essentially erased by the server. And if they're picked up, you'll probably have your account automatically banned as well. So yes, you can do those things, and there's then an external control that compares them against an authoritative source to see if it's been tampered with. Same goes for items. But just to protect people a bit from making it too easy, there are controls in place to make it harder to create and update and delete those things locally. Now, in terms of on the server itself, yes, we do want the client to be able to do it when they've done a particular thing. So there'll be a proof of work, integrity check such as a hash. There might be a checksum on the cache, which is compared against their account record. For example, you could do it something like that. I don't know the specifics of how it's done. I just know that it exists. On the server, we do want to be able to have create, update, and delete operations from the client, or at least we want the create and update. We probably don't want delete, and I'll get to that. But we want to say, yes, you've won a battle with a Pokemon. We will create that Pokemon in your account, in your Pokemon store. Or yes, you've powered up a Pokemon. We will update that record in your Pokemon store. Or yes, you've sent a Pokemon to be turned into candy. So we will delete that record from your individual account Pokemon store. So there are create, read, updates, and deletes that we want them to do, but we want them to do them when they are authorized, not just by the user being valid, but by some sort of proof of work. We want proof that they've defeated a Pokemon in battle. We want proof they've purchased something from the shop. We want proof that they've spent some candies to power one up, something along those lines. So there are cases where you want to say, yes, you can do these operations, but there will be an additional step to authorize them. We have the authentication of the account. We have the authorization saying that it should go through. And we are looking then at the authenticity aspect and the integrity aspect. Right. Are there any questions about this one? Or rather, I hope there are questions about this one. Or
there's one question, I'm not sure if you want to answer it now, that have integrity checks, something like hash. Did you already respond to this?
Yep, so hash or checksum or various other integrity checks that you could use are all workable there. And similarly for the authorization, you might have some proof of work when you're doing a Pokemon battle, and that gives you access to update the record or to update your account. But ultimately, locally, you probably don't want anything but read and create an update for the maps, because then you can pull them off Google Maps instead of having to transmit them from your central server, which is just a waste of money when someone else will do it for you for free. On the server side, you want the client to be able to update things, but you only want them to be able to do it with authorization. This model will depend entirely on the type of app you're building. So this is only relevant for Pokemon Go, that idea of the authorization, or it is relevant for other things, but it will depend on what you are building. So for example, for a banking app, you probably don't want to store any information on the local client device because it's almost all sensitive. So you want it to be on the server, and you want to have authentication and then authorization for any sensitive operations. For some social media apps, maybe an anonymous posting board, you just don't care at all what someone does. They can tamper with their local store, they can delete things on the main one. It might be a very open conversation thing, and then yes, it's going to be chaotic, but if you've accepted that, that's fine. And yes, so if you are doing any sort of integrity check, make sure that it is appropriately strong to what you're doing. So if you're doing it across a very small set, MD5 isn't collision safe, but if you only care about collisions within an hour, say, not such a problem. So it needs to be appropriately strong. Of course, given the ease of calculating an integrity checksum at the moment with the hardware we've got, you may as well just use something decently secure from the start by default, because then you don't have any of these trade-offs and issues. Right. That largely covers it. So let me get back to the screen share. So I want to say thanks to a couple of people. Obviously, there's a OWASP themselves, who've done the top 10 OWASP Cornucopia and the OWASP Mobile top 10, both risks and controls. And the comics are by a guy called Randall Munro of XKCD. Are there any questions? Is there anything anyone wants to ask? Are there any discussions? Does anyone have philosophical disagreements with my way of doing threat modeling? You are more than welcome to do so. There are many, many methods out there. My way is but one, and it's designed to be simple and quick and usable. So it's one to start with. It is not the end goal of threat modeling. It's just something to give you something workable to begin with.
So James, there was just one comment left. Make sure to use strong cryptography algorithms while performing integrity checks. For example, not MD5, which is not collision safe. So that was the only comment. Does this conclude your session?
It does, unless there's any further questions or discussion anyone wants to have.
Right. So we're going to give people a couple of minutes to think if they have any questions they wanted to still address, and we're going to start wrapping up in a moment.
So we've got a hand raised.
1 second.
Hello. Okay. Thanks for the session. It was very good. But I have a question regarding how do you encourage your customers to perform threat modeling before they start with the actual work? I mean, often we are called once they are finished their work and we do the penetration test and everything is broken. And do you think it makes some sense to do a threat model afterwards, or must it be done before the actual work starts?
Okay, so a threat model is massively more valuable if you do it as part of the design. There's no argument there. Depending on the type of development methodology you're using, there can be value in doing a threat model after you've built a product. And where it becomes really useful, and I have managed to get companies to do this, I'll tell you how in a minute, we'll get to that. But where it becomes really useful is where you're using some sort of agile or iterative process, because you can build a threat model and then you can start applying it to individual changes going through. So as part of the change process, before a single line of code is written for the change, you run it against the threat model just to check whether it's going to introduce any new risks or whether it closes some down, whether there's anything that you need to pick up and deal with. And when you're dealing with changes, of course, they're such a small subcomponent of a system that you're looking at maybe a minute or two to threat model against them effectively. So there is value in having and maintaining a threat model after deployment, but only if you're continuing to design new functionality and implement new changes.
Okay,
Does
thanks.
that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah. And as to getting people to use it, I've been in the very fortunate position of not being responsible for the pen testing, but of being dropped into the governance side of organizations, which makes it a lot easier to poke my nose into project management and start asking some really big questions there. And I've done it in various places through various different means. So where it is easiest is where they've essentially come to me and said, can you help us build out a threat modeling process? Because I have had that happen a few times, and usually that's coming from development rather than security. So they'll go to security and say, we want to start doing this sort of thing. Sometimes because they've been on a workshop like this when I'm really lucky. And I will then work with them over a course of days, weeks, or months, depending on how big the ask is, to build something up for them. So that's the perfect way to do it, where development want to implement it or security have encouraged development to go out and implement it. The other way is to do it by stealth, and that's where you work close to developers and might come in to do some risk management for them. And in those meetings where you're discussing risk management and closing down findings from penetration tests, you can use it to talk through with them and say, did you know that if you just do this bit earlier on, ask these questions at the beginning, you might have a lot of these findings closed down before you get to the pen test, and your pen test will look better and it will be less effort for you. So that's a hearts and minds campaign, and it's just persuading them that it is a valuable thing that they are perfectly capable of doing. Are there any other questions? I can see that Alex has raised a point in the Q&A, so that's just on, yeah, MD5 collisions can be a real problem for cache integrity. Yes, they can. Any collision can be a real problem for cache integrity. You don't want collisions if you can avoid them, except in certain very niche cases where you do want collisions, such as when you're attacking. Limor, could you let Alex speak? We've got a hand raised.
Yeah, he just has to unmute.
Oh, right, okay. The other Alex as well.
I don't know why it's... Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Hello.
Hello.
I just actually I wanted to say that MD5 collisions are very rarely a real problem for cache integrity. If such a collision could be a threat for your cache, then probably you have some deeper problems with your cache. Before that, if somebody can apply these mathematical methods to spoof MD5 signatures on your cache, you're probably on the other end of the airtight corridor. So you probably have to think about it before.
Yeah, no, you absolutely should be thinking about it before, and that is again the point of threat modeling. The collision is probably an out there threat, so you only get to it after you've closed down other things, which should render it an acceptable risk. It's something you have to accept might be possible, but it's so unlikely it's not necessarily worth addressing in full. Although if it's very
on
easy
the other
to
hand,
address,
there is no good reason to choose MD5 when you have much stronger algorithms that are not computationally prohibitive.
yeah, absolutely. There is no sense in compromising on security when it costs you nothing to improve it. Really, if it's going to be costly, if you're working, so there are cases where you might want to use MD5, for example, if you're working with embedded systems or very lightweight IoT devices, which are using properly designed embedded systems instead of being basically Linux servers, then computations do become expensive, but that's a very niche area and does not really apply to mobile development today.
Correct. Thank you.
Okay. Documenting the threat model. So it is, yes, use whatever the customer's familiar with. So Excel, I've done it in Word before. Jira is a popular one, just putting the output into tickets. So build it on a whiteboard, note it down, document it. It's whatever works for the customer. And you can do it anyway. You can stick up post-it notes to build a Kanban board if you want to. That works fine and works in some places, doesn't work in others. Probably works less well now that fewer people are in the office, but it's an option. Most practical from my perspective has usually been to essentially take the output and drop it into the development ticketing process, whatever that might be. So to put it into the design there, or into the project management process if you've been really lucky and been able to get involved at that stage of things where you really are working with the design rather than development. And project management tend to use tickets less, so that's more adaptable and often more about documenting in Word or Excel. or sometimes in Visio or a similar diagramming system, just attaching the points to interfaces saying, here's a question that needs to be answered before this can be approved. Any other questions? Okay, I think then that's
All
it.
right. Great session, James. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to listen in. I'm sure everybody also enjoyed it. We kept a really good list of attendees throughout this session. We thank you all and remind you that the session has been recorded and you will be able to access it later on as well. James, any final words?
No, if anyone does want to talk more about threat modeling, then do feel free to get in touch. It is probably my favorite security tool to use, and it's also one of the most underused ones I've ever come across.
What's the best way to contact you, James?
Probably on LinkedIn. I do have
LinkedIn.
email and so on, but I'm active enough on LinkedIn that I'll respond to messages quite quickly.
All right, wonderful. So I remind you that James is the owner of Boris Consultancy. So if you look that up, you will find him as well. And thank you again. I'm going to stop the recording and we're going to go to the next session. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.